Mohammed Shehada from Copenhagen. He is Chief of Communications at Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor, which is a team in Gaza gathering information about this mass grave. Mohammed, really good to see you. First of all, just tell us, what has your team discovered?
Well, basically, since the war started, we documented about 130 mass graves in Gaza. In many cases, it's the families or people that ran out of space, or because of the immense danger of what's happening, that they resort to this kind of desperate act. But in Gaza's two biggest hospitals, the Shifa Hospital and Nasser Hospital, Khan Younis, we see Israel deliberately committing atrocities of unimaginable levels and proportions to make a general statement to terrorize the population. So in both hospitals, we see multiple mass graves in which patients, women, children, civilians and refugees are dumped on top of each other and piled and then covered up by Israeli bulldozers. And it entails a great level of danger for these crews on the ground to try to find these bodies, discover them and identify them and present them to the families, because they can be bombed by Israeli drones at any second. It's not just the casualty figure here that is most disturbing. It's the nature of the killing. We see Israeli forces shooting at point blank and executing people who were blindfolded and handcuffed, so people who presented zero danger. We see Israeli tanks literally flattening the bodies of Gazans, running over them and turning them into mush. We see bodies that were burned to ash. And we see bodies that were hacked into pieces. There were corpses that were basically headless, either from shelling or being bombed. The nature of the killing and the scale, the magnitude, the severity, it is very clear that Israel is trying to make a statement to shock the population.
What have you done with the bodies and the evidence that you're collecting? Who will you present it to? Have you presented it indeed to the Israeli authorities themselves?
Well, we usually present it to the team that is presenting a case at the International Court of Justice. We present evidence to the UN Human Rights Council Investigative Committee. And of course, we present it to parties that are collaborating with the International Criminal Court. With Israeli authorities, there is always no response. Like, as soon as you present evidence of a massacre with very clear evidence pointing to the perpetrators, the Israeli response is always, we are looking into it. And once it gains more momentum, more international pressure, then they take the next step of saying, we will investigate. But these investigations never, and I cannot emphasize this enough, they never end up with holding anyone accountable, ever. We cannot find a single case where the IDF ended a process with investigation holding anyone accountable. But I think what was most striking about this incident is the insane level of mainstream media cover-up of this. If these mass graves were discovered in Ukraine or inside Israel itself after October 7th, you would have never seen the end of media coverage, condemnations, tears, and oozing of sympathy. But when it comes to the case of Gaza, I personally have not seen a single headline in any European or American mainstream media channel or newspaper on this at all. Instead, they were very busy covering the news of student protests at Columbia University, of students that were protesting the very mass graves that were dug by the IDF in Gaza. They became suddenly the perpetrators instead of solidarity groups with the victims.
Yeah, well, we're talking about it here on TRT World, but in terms of the operation itself, obviously you were saying that those that are carrying out the operation, they're under immense danger as well from attack. How much longer do you think this operation will last? And potentially, how many more bodies do you think you could find?
Well, the estimate is that there is about 600 to 700 bodies that were missing at the hospital, or individuals that went missing. Overall in Gaza, there's 2,000 individuals that went missing and 11,000 people that are presumed dead, stuck underneath the rubble of their homes. So at Al-Shifa Hospital, for instance, this process has been moving painstakingly slow because they don't have fuel to power these bulldozers. They have to dig with their own bare hands and shovels, and they do it very slowly at the time, pull a few bodies and then escape to safety and then come back again in those 2 or 3 hours in the day where the intensity of airstrikes is not very high. and it's the same at the Nasser hospital. It entails immense danger, so it's going to take a very long time to do this with the present risk of being bombed at any second.
And identification must be very difficult, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, the only identifiable traces of victims now that are written on the graves or the bodies is the color of the jacket, the kind of pants they were wearing. Families are identifying their the deceased relatives that were patients at the hospital from the wounds they had when they went to get an operation or when they were bombed and wounded in the first place. So we saw parents who identified their kids because of a stomach wound or a bandage on the leg or a cast on the arm. It is incredibly tormenting and cruel to the families. Like every time a new body is pulled out of the rubble, you see dozens and dozens of people running in the desperate hope to identify a loved one, and the disappointment ensues. There's a very large amount of unidentifiable bodies that were found and discovered at both Shifa Hospital and Nasser Hospital that are still awaiting people to pick them up. But in many cases, the bodies belong to families that were slaughtered completely altogether, wiped out from the civil registry. So there is no one left behind to claim the body in the first place.
Really good to get your thoughts on this. Thanks for that. Really appreciate it. Mohammed Shehada there, Chief of Communications at Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor.